Hello, I am your retro addict, and welcome to Things Your Kids Should Know About But Don't. Today we're going to be talking about hangouts, more specifically arcades. Don't get me wrong, I know arcades are still out there with their several hundred copies of Dance Dance Revolution and several thousand copies of Cruisin'. These are not the arcades from my childhood. The first game I ever played was the 800-pound behemoth known as Donkey Kong. So began my love affair with arcades and video games in general. I'm sure most people are familiar with Donkey Kong, Pac-Man, and to a lesser extent Galaga. But if not, there are plenty of YouTube videos out there that cover the history of these games in great detail. I grew up in a small tourist town in New Jersey called Wildwood. There's a boardwalk off the beach that has amusement park rides and arcades everywhere you turned. Some of these arcades exist to this day. The best arcades made you lose track of time. I myself experienced this, walking in with the sun to my back, high in the sky, and walking out seeing the moon and the stars. The best comparison I could make would be the Las Vegas casinos, only slightly darker and more electronic noises. Every week, I would look for new games to be brought into the arcade. Rotating games in and out kept the arcade current and dynamic. It was able to evolve with the changing technology that was coming out from month to month. Despite this, there was usually a dark corner of the arcade that had the classic games from yesterday in it. It didn't usually get too much attention though, as most patrons were plunking their quarters into the newer, shinier games. When arcades first got popular, tournaments were held across the country to determine who was the best at certain games such as Pac-Man or Donkey Kong. One of the arcades I enjoyed the most when I was a kid was called Gateway 26. It featured the popular games that every other arcade was carrying, but it also had things like skill games, such as basketball, where the goal was to make as many balls go into the hoop as you could in an allotted time limit, and skee-ball, one of my personal favorites, a modified version of bowling where the object was to get small wooden balls into point buckets at the end of the lane. Games like these usually rewarded tickets depending on how well you did, that you could trade in for cheap prizes that were displayed behind the redemption counter. Nintendo was the undisputed champion of home consoles by 1985, and it was a pretty good pairing. If it weren't for Nintendo, we would have never had Donkey Kong, a revolutionary game in its own right, or Mario, who made his first appearance in that game. Nintendo definitely had a presence in arcades, and this was never made more apparent than when they came out with a cabinet called the PlayChoice 10. This was one of the first games that offered multiple titles, and in a slight twist of irony, was the only one that allowed you to have the experience of playing games that were exclusively licensed to their home consoles in the arcade. Several other game companies followed this format, having multiple games in one cabinet such as Neo Geo and SNK. No talk about arcades would be complete without mentioning pinball machines. Just about every arcade worth their weight in quarters had at least 3 or 4 of them. A look at Wikipedia tells us the pinball games have been around in some form or fashion for a long time, and while these machines had their heyday back in the 70s, they began to decline in popularity as video games were rising. They did, however, start gaining back fans briefly as arcades declined in the 90s. As a kid in the 80s, these games were fairly modernized, and the ones I remember the most were the Addams Family and Funhouse pins, as I saw those in almost every arcade I frequented. One of the things I recall with fondness is the old practice of putting a quarter on the edge of the screen to call next game. I wonder if that practice is still used. I know that in Wreck-It Ralph they kind of threw a nod in there to that with the little girl putting her quarter on the game. So I know it wasn't just in my area of the country. Arcade games in the beginning were less story-driven and more tests of one's skill. They were simple but difficult until mastered, and I believe that was the biggest draw at first. In the dawn of arcade games, controllers were sparse, usually consisting of a joystick and 1 or 2 buttons, if that. A couple of games that broke with that more traditional setup were Centipede, Marble Madness, and Tempest. These games used a trackball setup, and I don't know how many times my friends and I pinched our fingers between the ball and the edge of the recess the ball was in, trying to get the sprite on the screen to do what we wanted them to do. As competition became more fierce, though, cabinets and controllers became more elaborate and flashy. Two of the best examples I have of these are Pole Position and Paperboy. Pole Position came in two varieties, the stand-up cabinet and a sit-down one that gave you the look and feel of driving a car. Cool, huh? This was a racing game, so the joystick and buttons were traded out for a steering wheel, gear shifter, and accelerator brake pedals, and this made the game awesome. Sitting down in a pole position cabinet was a great experience because it made you feel like you were really on the track racing with other cars. Games like Cruisin', Daytona 500, and Spy Hunter went on to use their setup, albeit Spy Hunter used a more James Bond type steering wheel, being a cross between a steering wheel and airplane controls. Paperboy was another game that stuck out for its uniqueness. It had one of the most interesting controllers I ever came across. As the name implies, you play as a paperboy delivering newspapers for a 7-day stretch. While doing this, you must avoid obstacles and people. It was a very original concept at the time, and the controller was no different. A set of handlebars from a bicycle was used, and it really made the game stand out. Another standout was the cocktail table video game. These cabinets offered the benefit to the consumer of being able to sit down at a game to play, and even had room to put a drink on it. Hence the name. The benefit to the owner of a cocktail table video game was that they took up less space than the uprights, so you would see these in bars or clubs mostly, and actual arcades seldomly. The two most popular games that came in this variety were Pac-Man and Galaga, although I seem to remember seeing elevator action in one of them. If someone else has seen it, please let me know. Nowadays, these cabinets as well as the uprights are popular among hobbyists, and with the technology today coupled with the right amount of money and know-how, anyone can have an arcade right in their home. So save your quarters, arcades are coming back. A final variation of controls was the light gun. Anyone who's played Duck Hunt on Nintendo knows what I'm talking about. Strangely, the first light gun game doesn't come from the golden age of arcades, but from the amusement parks of the 1930s. And stranger than that one little piece of fact is the first game to use a light gun was an electromechanical game, also known as Duck Hunt. The 80s surprisingly didn't have many arcade games that had light gun support, but the 90s had them in spades with games such as House of the Dead, Terminator 2, Lethal Enforcers, and Big Buck Hunter. On a small tangent, at the time of this recording, there is no peripheral gun for the Xbox 360. I say this because it astounds me that with the overwhelming number of first-person shooters out there, such as Halo and Modern Warfare, it should be a match made in heaven. I digress though. This isn't about Xbox 360. This is about arcades. Here's an interesting fact. Nolan Bushnell, who was one of the founders of Atari, was also the founder and creator of a little pizza arcade we all know as Chuck E. Cheese. Chuck E. Cheese was the first arcade / anything starting way back in the late 70s under the name Pizza Time. As arcades gained in popularity and American culture got plugged into the world of video gaming, you'd see games popping up in some very interesting settings. Movie theaters, bars, nightclubs, restaurants, and naturally amusement parks were all getting in on the act. Everywhere you turned, there would be a Pac-Man or Donkey Kong cabinet staring you in the face. Carnival Cruise Lines even had an arcade and powered their ocean liners, for Christ's sake. Today we have Dave & Buster's, CC's Pizza, or GameWorks, depending on where you live in the country. Up to the mid-90s, though, they were everywhere. Movies, music, and TV shows all showed influences of video games, and the arcades where they lived. In movies, we had Tron, The Last Starfighter, and War Games. Everybody was singing along with Pinball Wizard and catching Pac-Man fever on the radio. Even Will Smith, who started out with a musical career, had a song about Donkey Kong on his first album. TV shows were being plastered all over Saturday morning cartoons with shows like Pole Position, Dragon's Lair, and Captain N, the Game Master. I remember fondly being able to get a roll of quarters on the weekend from my allowance and spending hours in my favorite arcade. Machines back then only cost $0.25, and there were no arbitrary time limits, so $10 in quarters went a long way. Herein lies one of the downfalls of the arcades of yesteryear. While the arcade-style beat-em-ups were tons of fun, especially when you think of games like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Gauntlet, having multiple players on the same machine simultaneously should have been a good thing for arcade owners, right? The price started going up. Some games were starting to cost 50 cents per play, such as Street Fighter II. An awesome game, by the way. Most games were still only a quarter to play, so if you wanted to play that hot new game, the price, while not unreasonable, was going to be a little bit more than what you were used to. So what went wrong? Arcades in my area of the country have all but vanished, as I'm sure many other parts of the country could claim as well. I've heard a good amount of theories on why arcades went the way of the 8-track tape, and I believe it's an amalgam of several. First and foremost, the graphics in the arcade were blowing away everything on the market, but with each new generation of home gaming, the system got more and more powerful. Games got more complex and story-driven, and by the time you finished one of these games in the arcade, you probably would have spent enough money to buy the cabinet and bring it home with you. Let's be honest here. If you had the choice of sitting down in front of your TV, half naked, and picking up a controller, or driving 5 miles to the closest arcade to play the exact same game, which choice would you make? Imagine trying to play Skyrim in the arcade to the end. I hope you brought food and a sleeping bag. You'll need it. Another reason I touched on a minute ago was the price. 50 cents a game was one thing. You could chalk that up to inflation, but just as an example, NBA Jam, when it first hit arcades, cost $2 to play through an entire basketball game. $2 only bought you 8 minutes of game time, where a couple years prior to that, $2 may last you 8 hours depending on your skill level. Remember that the game designers weren't selling their games to the patrons. They were selling to arcade owners whose sole interest in a game would be how fast the game would start turning a profit for them. As the skill level of the player increased, the profitability for the arcade owner decreased. So in addition to games costing upwards of $1 to several, we started seeing time limits placed on gameplay, which I find to be a cheap way of parting people of their money. It used to be that you died a couple times, then you got a game over screen. Now, your minutes are up. Time to cough up another $1 or two. There aren't too many games today that can't be played on home consoles, and with the prevalence of emulators on the internet, anybody can have an arcade right on their home computer or laptop. The golden age of arcades was a very innocent time, not just for me, but many people my age. If you are 20 years old or younger, you probably haven't experienced what it feels like to visit a real video game arcade, and that's a shame, because you are missing out on a great experience. Playing a video game against or alongside someone you just met, or with a group of your friends, the sounds of the arcade, the thrill of playing that new game, or watching a very skilled player getting further in the game than you ever could have. I miss this part of my childhood, and if you ever get the chance to play in a classic arcade, I strongly recommend you do so. The experience is mesmerizing, and now you know what you should about arcades. Today we have Dave & Buster's, CC's Pizza. Shit. CC's Pizza.
To keep it, that's a keeper, bro.
Okay. Okay. Okay.